It was the autumn of 1987 when Simone Auger, 28 years old and newly alone, became the reluctant owner of 460 acres of Quebec farmland she didn't know how to save. The letter from the lawyer had arrived on a Thursday. Her father, Henri Auger, had died of a heart attack in the East Field on a Tuesday morning, still holding the fence post driver he'd been using to repair the north pasture line. The paramedic said he likely hadn't felt much. Simone wasn't sure that was true, but she held on to it anyway. Her husband, Mark, had waited exactly 11 days before he told her. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where her father had eaten every meal of his adult life, and Mark had his coffee cup in both hands, the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. He said the farm had always been Henri's dream, not theirs. He said the debt was significant, and the timing was terrible. He said a developer from Montreal had already made inquiries and the money would set them up properly somewhere else. Somewhere easier. He said the word easier 3 times. Simone listened to all of it. Then she asked him if he had eaten. He left the following morning. The sound of his truck going down the gravel road was swallowed by the flat gray sky over the St. Lawrence lowlands, and then there was only the wind through the spruce stand along the western fence and the slow drip of the eavesdrow that had needed fixing since July, and the particular silence of a farm that is waiting to see what you will do next. Let me tell you about that farm. It wasn't beautiful in the way people mean when they say that about the countryside. It wasn't rolling hills and red barns and golden light. The Auger property was 460 acres of clay-heavy bottomland in the Montérégie region, south of the river, stubborn and dark, and prone to flooding in the spring. Henri had coaxed soybeans and corn from it for 30 years by knowing exactly what it wanted and when it wanted it. The farmhouse was white with green shutters and needed paint on the south side. The machine shed held a Massey Ferguson 398 with a cracked hydraulic line, a grain auger with a seized bearing in the drive shaft, and a 4-wheel drive tractor that Henri had bought, used in 1979, and rebuilt so many times that Simone sometimes thought it was more his work than the manufacturer's. The farm also held, as of October 3, 1987, a line of credit at the Caisse Populaire in Saint-Rémy that was larger than Simone had known about, and an operating loan that came due before the spring planting season. 3 days after Mark left, Simone drove into town. Mr. Beausoleil at the Caisse was a careful man. He had a neat gray mustache and the particular quality of stillness that comes from decades of delivering unwelcome news with measured sympathy. He had known Henri Auger. He said so immediately, and with what seemed like genuine feeling, before he opened the folder on his desk. He let her read the numbers herself. She appreciated that, at least. The operating loan was overdue for renewal. The line of credit had been drawn further than she'd realized. Henri had put in new drainage tile on the lower 40 that past spring, an investment that wouldn't pay back until the yields came in. And they hadn't come in yet because Henri had died in September before the harvest was finished. The combine was still in the field. 40 acres of soybeans were still standing, drying down on the stalk, waiting for someone to take them off. Mr. Beausoleil folded his hands. He told her there was a consortium from Montreal acquiring parcels in the region. Corporate operation, efficient, well capitalized. They were paying above market value because they wanted contiguous acreage, and the Auger property filled a gap in their holdings. He said the word consortium, the way people say it when they want you to feel that something inevitable and reasonable is being offered to you. He said she would walk away with enough to buy a house outright. Start fresh. He said start fresh the way Mark had said easier, as if the farm were a mistake her family had been making for 30 years, and this was her chance to correct it on their behalf. Simone looked at him. She said, "The soybeans need to come off before the first hard frost. After that, I'll be in to talk about renewing the loan." Mr. Biozalel blinked. He said she couldn't operate the combine herself. He said the drainage repair still needed to be finished before the ground froze, or they'd lose the investment entirely. He said she had no hired help and no capital to bring any on. He said these things not unkindly, which almost made it worse. "The harvest will come in," Simone said. "I'll be in touch." Now let me explain something about Henri Auger, because you cannot understand what happened next without understanding him first. Henri was not a tall man or a loud man. He had gone to the agricultural college in St. Hyacinthe in the early 1950s and come back to the farm his own father had left him, and he had farmed it for the rest of his life with the kind of focus that other people sometimes mistook for stubbornness. He did not expand recklessly when the 70s made credit cheap and land prices soar. He did not subscribe to the doctrine of growth for growth's sake. He believed that the land you had was enough land if you understood it well enough, and that the machinery you owned was sufficient machinery if you took care of it the way it deserved to be taken care of. He had one philosophy about debt, which he stated plainly and often. It is a weight you carry into the field every single morning, and the field is already heavy enough. He had taught Simone to drive the tractor when she was 9. He had taught her to read the warning signs in an engine. The particular note a belt makes when it's beginning to crack, the way a hydraulic pump hesitates a half-second before it fails, the smell of hot metal that means something is running dry. He taught her in the machine shed on cold mornings, his breath visible in the air above the open engine cowling, his voice patient and specific. He didn't teach her because he thought she'd need it. He taught her because he believed that knowledge was the only thing no one could repossess. Have you ever known someone who carried their expertise the way other people carry their posture, completely naturally without performing it? That was Henri Auger. He could walk into a field in June and tell you the yield in October. He could listen to the MF398 idle and tell you which injector was running lean. He once diagnosed a seized kingpin on the grain cart by the sound it made going over the culvert at the end of the lane without stopping or slowing down or looking at anything other than the road ahead. He left Simone 3 things in the machine shed. The first was his toolbox, a battered gray Mastercraft chest, 4 drawers deep, that had sat against the east wall of the shed for as long as she could remember. It was organized with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Every tool in its place, every socket in sequence. The chest was the most orderly object in an otherwise complicated life, and Simone had always understood without being told that it was a kind of altar. The second was a row of binders along the shelf above the workbench, gray binders, each one labeled in her father's block print, Massey 398, Engine, Massey 398, Hydraulics, Auger, Drive, Drivetrain, Draniel Specs, 40. They were thick with photocopied pages from service manuals, annotated in pencil, with small hand-drawn diagrams in the margins where the official illustrations hadn't been clear enough to suit him. The third was a green spiral notebook, ordinary, the kind you buy at the pharmacy for $1.50. In it, in his careful small handwriting, he had recorded every repair, every service interval, every part number, every quirk of every machine and every acre of ground since he had taken over the farm in 1961. It was the farm's memory, 26 years of observation, distilled into ink on lined paper. That night, after leaving the case, Simone didn't go to bed. She went to the machine shed. The air was cold and smelled of diesel and old rubber and the particular metallic sharpness of October. She switched on the fluorescent light and stood there a moment, looking at the 398 with the hydraulic line that was weeping fluid onto the concrete floor in a thin, steady thread. She looked at the green notebook on the workbench, where she'd left it when she'd gone through the shed the week before. She opened it to the section on the Massey Ferguson. Henri had written about the hydraulic system across 11 pages. There were 3 previous entries about this exact line: a high-pressure fitting on the remote circuit that he'd noted as a weak point as far back as 1983, replaced fitting 916 Jake Mail, part number 1874082. Watch for weeping at ferrule junction under sustained load. This line should be replaced, not just refitted, when convenient. He'd written that in the fall of 1985. He'd written when convenient because he'd meant to do it the following spring, and then the lower 40 had needed the tile work and he'd put it off. It hadn't been convenient yet. Simone found the hydraulic schematic in the gray binder and laid it open on the bench beside the notebook. She studied the fitting configuration. She looked at the line itself. The ferrule crimped slightly where it met the swaged end, just as her father had predicted. She understood exactly what she was looking at. She drove to the co-op in Napierville the next morning and ordered the replacement line and fittings. The parts man there was named Jerome, and he had a way of not quite looking at women directly when they asked technical questions. So she read the part numbers off the notebook herself and set them on the counter in front of him. The total was $43. She spent the next day bleeding the hydraulic system and fitting the new line. Working from her father's binder, every torque spec followed exactly. She had to stop twice to warm her hands because the temperature had dropped overnight and the cold made it hard to feel the fittings properly. The second time, she stood in the doorway of the shed with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and watched the light change over the soybean fields. The pods brittle and brown, the stalks rattling slightly in the wind, ready. When she started the tractor and put the hydraulics through their cycle, the line held. There was no weeping at the ferrule. The combine was more complicated. The seized bearing on the auger drive had locked up the entire unloading system, which meant the combine could harvest but couldn't empty its tank. The bearing itself wasn't difficult to source. Henri had written down the fake bearing number in the green notebook, along with a note that said this bearing is the weak point of the whole system. Carry a spare. There was, in fact, a spare bearing still in its box on the parts shelf, exactly where Henri had put it. What was difficult was getting the old bearing off the shaft, because it had seized so thoroughly that the inner race had welded itself to the steel by rust and heat and time. Simone spent the better part of 3 days on that bearing. She used a bearing puller. She applied penetrating oil and heat from the propane torch. She worked in the cold shed until her shoulders ached and her eyes watered from the cold and the fumes. She called her cousin Bertrand, who ran a shop in Huntingdon and was, after Henri, the most capable mechanic she'd ever known. Bertrand drove out on the second evening with a different style of puller and a cheerful certainty that he could have the bearing off inside an hour. It took him 2.5 hours, and he swore in a language that was technically French, but bore little resemblance to any variety Simone had learned. The bearing came off, the new one went on. Bertrand charged her nothing, which she didn't argue about, but she noted it in the green notebook. Oct. 14, 1987. Auger drive bearing replaced. Fag 3207X, B. Garneau assisted. Owe him one. She wrote it in the same spot Henri would have, at the bottom of the combine section, in the same careful block printing she'd grown up reading. The harvest took 8 days. She couldn't run the combine alone for the full day, because the combine needed to be running while the grain cart was being unloaded into the truck, and she couldn't be in 2 places at once. Bertrand came back for 4 of those days. A neighboring farmer, Mr. Lacoste, who had known Henri for 20 years and said nothing more about the situation than "I'll be here at 7, came for 2 more. Simone drove the grain cart and the truck. She kept the combine fueled and the field unplugged when the stalks bunched up in the header. She logged 11-hour days and came in after dark smelling of soybean dust and diesel and ate whatever was fastest. The soybeans yielded 42 bushels to the acre on the harvested ground. Given the wet spring and the drought in July, Henri would have said that was a respectable number. Simone wrote it in the green notebook. She sold the beans at the elevator in Saint-Remy. Every dollar that wasn't spoken for went to the caisse. The winter that followed was the hardest she had known. Not because of the work. The farm was quiet in winter, as farms are, but because of the weight of the quiet. The farmhouse felt larger than it should have. The evenings were long. Mark had taken his things, which weren't many, but their absence had a presence of its own. She thought about the consortium's offer more than she wanted to admit. She thought about it late at night, when the wind came off the river flat and found every gap in the old farmhouse's insulation, and the kitchen felt very small, and the debt felt very large. There was an evening in February when the propane furnace stopped firing in the middle of the night, and she woke at 2 in the morning to a house that was 8 degrees and dropping. She found the problem, a fouled thermocouple, which she'd seen her father deal with once, and replaced it by flashlight in the utility room, her breath smoking in the cold air, her fingers slow and stupid with the chill. When the furnace caught and the heat came back on, she sat down on the utility room floor with her back against the wall and felt, for a few minutes, the full weight of what she had taken on. She sat there long enough that the floor started to feel warm. Then she went to the machine shed. She didn't need anything from the shed. She just needed to be in it. She turned on the light and stood there in the smell of oil and cold metal and looked at the gray toolbox against the wall, and at the green notebook on the workbench, and at the Massey 398 sitting solid and quiet on the concrete, and she felt she would not have been able to explain this to anyone, and she didn't try, less alone. She was standing there when she noticed, tucked under the notebook, a folded piece of paper she hadn't seen before. Her father's stationery, the blue kind he'd bought at the hardware store in town. She unfolded it. He had written 4 lines. "The farm does not ask you to be fearless. It only asks you to come back tomorrow. Whatever you decide, decide it on your own terms. The land will remember." She didn't sleep again that night, but she went back inside, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table until the light came up, and when it did, she put on her barn coat and went out to do chores. Now, let me tell you what was happening to everyone else. The late 80s were a difficult time for agriculture in Quebec, but the difficulty was not evenly distributed. The farmers who had borrowed heavily through the early part of the decade, who had taken on land at the peak of the market and finance-backed equipment they couldn't have afforded on their own yields, those farmers were in serious trouble. The interest rates that had climbed through the early 80s had softened but remained punishing for anyone carrying a large variable rate debt load. Commodity prices were unpredictable. Input costs were not. The men at the co-op and the equipment dealer and the grain elevator talked in the particular clipped way of people watching a storm come in from a direction they'd been warned about and chosen to ignore. Parcels were being listed. Auctions were being scheduled. The same bankers who had encouraged expansion in the good years were now reviewing files with a new kind of attention. The auger property had very little debt, comparatively. Henri had borrowed for the drainage tile and nothing else in the previous decade. Simone's operating line was manageable. She was not comfortable. She was not, by any reasonable measure, secure. But she was not leveraged in the way that was, for some of her neighbors, beginning to prove fatal. She planted that spring with Bertrand's help, and her father's field notes and a seed variety Henri had switched to 3 years earlier because he'd read something about its performance on heavy clay soils in a provincial extension report that he'd kept in the gray binders. It wasn't a fashionable choice. It wasn't the variety the seed rep had been pushing that year. But Henri had trialed it on the lower 20, and the numbers had been better than anything he'd grown there in a decade, and he had written, "This is the one at the bottom of the page," in his notebook. Simone planted the lower 40 in that variety. She spent the summer learning, in the way you can only learn by doing, the rhythms of the farm without anyone to defer to. She learned to read the sky over the river the way her father had read it. The particular quality of light that meant rain before morning, the stillness in the spruce stand that meant the pressure was dropping. She learned which field needed attention when and why, not from the extension office, but from the green notebook and her own eyes. She asked questions of Mr. Lacoste, who answered them without making her feel she should already know the answers. She called Bertrand when the 398 made a sound she couldn't identify, and he would listen to her description and tell her which binder to open. The second harvest was better than the first. The lower 40 in Henri's variety yielded 49 bushels to the acre. She noted it in the green notebook and drove to the elevator with a feeling that she recognized after a moment as satisfaction. It was not happiness, exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the specific satisfaction of having understood a problem well enough to solve it. She paid down the line of credit. She bought at a farm auction in November a used grain auger to replace the original, a better machine, in better condition, at a quarter of the replacement cost, and Bertrand and Mr. Lacoste helped her set it up on a Saturday afternoon, and she fed them soup afterwards in the kitchen where her father had eaten every meal of his adult life. The years that followed were not easy, but they were hers. She did not expand. She did not take on more land when it became available, as it did with increasing frequency, as the farm crisis wore on and the parcels around her began to change hands. She was not tempted by the logic of scale because her father had never believed in it, and she had inherited his skepticism along with his notebook and his toolbox. She invested instead in the soil itself, cover crops in the fall rotation, reduce tillage on the most erosion-prone fields, a compost program that her neighbors initially regarded as eccentric and later began quietly to ask her about. Her input costs stayed low. Her yields stayed consistent. She owed no one anything she couldn't manage. One afternoon in the spring of 1991, a familiar car came down the gravel road. Mr. Beausoleil from the Cais, older now, the gray mustache a little whiter. He parked by the machine shed and walked over to where Simone was calibrating the planter. The seed meters laid out on a clean tarp on the shed floor in the order she'd removed them, the way her father had taught her. He stood there a moment, looking at the organized shed, the repaired and running equipment, the fields beyond the fence greening up in the April light. "I drive past here in the fall sometimes," he said. "Your beans last year were the best-looking crop in the region." Simone set down the calibration weight and looked at him. "It was a reasonable year," she said. He shook his head. "It wasn't," he said. "Not for most people." He was quiet for a moment. "I came to tell you something, Simone. I gave you the wrong advice in 1987. I looked at what was in front of me, a young woman, a complicated file, a market that was moving in a particular direction, and I told you to take the easy door." He paused. "I should have looked more carefully. I should have seen that you knew what you were doing." Simone waited. "Your father was right about the debt," Mr. Beausoleil said. "We all knew it, I think. We just had other interests at the time. He met her eyes. I'm sorry. Simone wiped her hands on a rag and shook his hand. His hand was still the clean, soft hand of a man who worked indoors. Thank you for coming, she said. She meant it. He left, and she went back to the seed meters. Several months later, in the early autumn, another vehicle came down the gravel road. A green half-ton, one she recognized. Mark got out. He looked at the farm. The fence lines, the well-tended yard, the old 398 parked neatly by the barn, the fields in the particular late-season gold of a good year's soybeans. And he stood there for a long moment without speaking. Simone came out onto the porch and watched him. He was thinner than she remembered. He'd been working in northern Alberta, she'd heard, in the oil patch, and the oil patch had done what oil patches sometimes do. He had the look of a man who had bet on one kind of certainty and found it less certain than advertised. He didn't come up to the porch. He stayed by the truck, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the farm the way you look at something you gave away and can't ungive. I heard from people in town, he said. They say you're the only one around here who didn't lose a parcel. Simone said nothing. I was wrong, Simone, he said, about all of it, about your father's way of doing things, about what this place was worth. He looked directly at her then. About you. She felt no bitterness. She had discovered, sometime in the second winter, that bitterness was a thing you could choose not to carry, in the way you could choose to let a field lie fallow, rather than push it past what it had to give. She had chosen to let it rest. She had been too busy, in any case, to tend it. I know you were, she said, and that was all. He nodded. He got back in the truck and drove down the gravel road, and the dust settled in the still autumn air, and the farm was quiet again in the way it had learned to be quiet. Not empty, but full of the particular sound of a place that is working and at peace. Let me take you forward now, a long way forward. It is the fall of 2019, and Simone Auger is 60 years old and looks it in the way that people who have worked outside for 30 years look their age. The lines in her face are honest, her hands are strong, and she moves with the economy of someone who has never had the time to be inefficient. The farm is still 460 acres. It is still the Auger property, though the farmhouse has a new furnace and a repaired south wall and a kitchen that her father would recognize entirely. The machine shed holds a newer tractor, a John Deere she bought with cash in 2004, and beside it, the Massey Ferguson 398, which is now old enough to qualify as a classic, but runs as well as it did when Henri bought it used in 1979, because Simone has maintained it with the same attention he would have brought to it, and because the knowledge of how to do so has never left the gray binders on the shelf. She is known in the region now in a specific way. Not famous, farming doesn't generate that kind of notice, but consulted. Young farmers, graduates of agricultural programs with their precision agriculture apps and their variable rate seeding prescriptions, come to her not for the technology which she uses judiciously and without sentimentality, but for the underlying thing. They want to know how to read a field. They want to know how to think about debt. They want to know how to make decisions in the absence of certainty, which is the condition agriculture presents every single year without exception. She answers them honestly. She shows them the green notebook, which now has a second volume beside it, in the same kind of green spiral cover from the same pharmacy in town, filled in her own block printing. She shows them Henri's service manuals with the penciled annotations in the margins. There is one afternoon that autumn where she is in the shed with her niece's son, a young man of 19 named Theo, who has decided he wants to farm and has the look of someone who means it. She is showing him how to read a bearing for where, the specific way you spin the race and feel for, the catch that means the cage is beginning to go, sound it makes under load when the grease is overdue. Your great-grandfather believed, she tells him, her voice even, that the farm wasn't something you owned. It was something you were responsible for. There's a difference. She hands him the bearing and watches him turn it in his hands, learning the feel of it. The people who thought they owned it, who thought they could leverage it and push it and extract from it whatever they needed, most of them are gone from this county now. The land is still here. Theo turns the bearing carefully. He feels the catch. There, Simone says. You feel it? He nods. That's what it sounds like when something is telling you what it needs, she says. Everything tells you if you're quiet enough to listen. The machines, the soil, the weather. You just have to learn the language. She takes the bearing back, sets it on the bench, notes it in the green notebook. 2019 398 rear wheel hub, LH bearing, replaced before spring. She hands him a clean rag and nods toward the hub. The toolbox is behind him, gray and battered and organized with the same precision it has always held. The green notebooks, both of them, are on the shelf above the workbench. The binders are beside them, the spines soft with use. The men at the bank had told her to take the easy door. Her husband had called the farm a burden and left in the dust of his own certainty. Everyone who had looked at a young woman standing alone on 460 acres of clay-heavy bottomland had seen a problem waiting to be liquidated. They had not seen what she had. They had not seen Henri Ogre's daughter, who had been taught to listen for what things need, and who understood, as her father had understood before her, that patience and knowledge and the willingness to come back tomorrow are worth more than any amount of borrowed money in the world. The land had remembered her care, and she had never once given it a reason to forget.